The writing of history is never completely objective, but always intermingled with the politics of power. The historian always has a political, religious or social agenda that is promulgated by his or her writing of a certain type of history, and there is always a larger structure of power which directs the historian's pen. This means that we must ultimately ask the question, why have some sources placed the blame on Saint Cyril, and how might doing so further their own political agendas? And ultimately then we must ask, why should we accept these historical documents which blame Saint Cyril for the murder of Hypatia as recording some sort of objective truth? Why should we accept these accusations without challenging their veracity? Background to the death of Hypatia. Orestes, the cause of the outbreak of violence. Orestes, the prefect of Alexandria, was the cause of the outbreak of violence, since he arrested a great devotee of Saint Cyril and publicly tortured him simply for suspecting that he was spying for Saint Cyril. Young writes, the first outbreak of violence came when a great devotee of Cyril was caught eavesdropping on an occasion when the prefect was issuing regulations for the Jewish theatricals on the Sabbath. Orestes arrested Cyril's supposed spy and there and then publicly tortured him. Young provides a brief yet accurate account of the episode of tension between Christians and Jews in Alexandria. Cyril complained to the Jewish leaders, who promptly plotted against the Christians. At night they raised an outcry that a certain church was on fire, and then slaughtered all the Christians who turned out to save it. The murder of Hypatia. At the beginning of Saint Cyril's 4th year as Pope, a mob of Christians ambushed the carriage of the famous Neoplatonic philosopher Hypatia and dragged her into a church where they murdered her. Since the time of the pagan philosopher Damascus, who hated the Christians, 130 years after the events and onwards until the present day, Saint Cyril's enemies held him personally responsible for the crime. Young states that Hypatia was the most distinguished pagan of the time, a Neoplatonist philosopher who could hold her own in any academic circle. Orestes was clearly impressed by her, and they were frequently in each other's company. The Christian mob decided it was she who was influencing Orestes against Cyril, the pagan connection again. Analyses by 20th century contemporary historians in the light of the writings of historians contemporary to the events themselves. Socrates was the greatest historian during Saint Cyril's days. He was born at Constantinople, probably early in the reign of Theodosius the Younger, AD 408, or according to others, AD 380. As a strong supporter of the Novatians, Socrates despised Saint Cyril because Cyril shut up the churches of the Novatians at Alexandria. For this reason, among others, he sought to bring Saint Cyril and his church into disrepute. However, it is clear that he did not state that Saint Cyril enticed the mob to murder Hypatia. McGuckin writes, Socrates says that this event brought no small reproach on Cyril and the Church of the Alexandrians. Some, most famously Gibbon, who calls the murder an exploit of Cyril's, blatantly misinterpret this remark when they consider the murder as an act in which he was also personally involved. The pagan philosopher Damascus also recounted the incident, specifically attributing personal blame and complicity to Cyril, but he was writing 130 years after the events, and his whole account is evidently prejudiced from the start and suffused with a bitter hatred of the way in which Christianity had suppressed his profession and way of life. Following Gibbon, Charles Kingsley, with more regard for romance than fact in his novel Hypatia, lost no opportunity to paint Cyril as the evil villain of the piece, and the mythic caricature he provided became fashionable. More recently, Wickham is more just to Cyril, and certainly on the grounds of deeper scholarly judgment, when he summarises the early crises of his administration as follows. The facts are not to be denied. The picture they yield is not one of a fanatical priest hungry for power, heading a howling mob, but of an untried leader attempting and initially failing to master popular forces. In line with McGuckin's analysis, Wace and Piercy state, as for Damascius's assertion that Cyril really prompted the murder, we cannot consider as evidence the statement of a pagan philosopher who lived about 130 years after the event and was a thorough hater of Christianity. We are justified in regarding it with Canon Robertson as an unsupported calumny. L.R. Wickham further attests in the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity, violence marred the first years of his episcopate in a city prone to riots and lynchings. Quarrels among pagans, Jews and Christians, and between Cyril and the governor Orestes, culminated in the horrifying murder by a Christian mob of the distinguished pagan philosopher Hypatia, 415. That Cyril was responsible for the violence is a myth enshrined in Charles Kingsley's novel Hypatia, and since perpetuated. That he was not for some years master of his own house is a fair deduction, and the government at the time did not condemn him personally. Historian A. Luth also writes, Cyril has suffered such neglect in modern times that apart from his conciliar letters, he is unrepresented in the standard late Victorian English translation of the Fathers, the Library of Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers. Part of the reason for this is doubtless his depiction in Charles Kingsley's famous novel Hypatia, 1853, as a sinister figure, cruel and unscrupulous. All this, however, provides a poor basis for understanding one whom Christians, from at least the 7th century onwards, regarded as the seal of the Fathers. Susan Wessel wrote in her book, Cyril of Alexandria and the Nestorian Controversy, The Making of a Saint and of a Heretic, the Parabolani were never officially implicated in the greatest act of terror of the time, Hypatia's murder, for none of the laws even alludes to the incident. She added in the same book, in February 418, Theodosius II promulgated a new set of laws that restored Cyril's authority over the Parabolani and increased their numbers from 5 to 600. Had Cyril and the Parabolani been unambiguously implicated in the murder of Hypatia, then it is most unlikely that Theodosius would ever have restored the group to Cyril's control. We may plausibly conclude that Hypatia's murder can be attributed to a ruffian band of Christians who were not among the Parabolani, but who believed that Hypatia's highly visible encounters with the Alexandrian elite threatened Cyril's exercise of power within the city.